Hi, and welcome back to this new seminar in the Security and Cryptography module. In today, we will look at a property called perfect forward secrecy, or forward secrecy sometimes, which is an important property that is sometimes demanded of our protocols and systems. So we will look today at what the classical definition of perfect forward secrecy is, and give some examples where the property doesn't hold and some other examples where the property holds. And for those examples where the protocol does hold or does provide this property, we will look at two mechanisms that give us perfect forward secrecy. One of them is based on DiffieHellman and the other one on temporary public key pairs or asymmetric cryptography. And towards the end, we will look at an alternative definition of perfect forward secrecy. So we will use the terms forward secrecy and perfect forward secrecy interchangeably. We don't distinguish between these two terms going forward. There are a couple of links on videos on this topic that you could look at. One from lynda.com, the other one from Dev Central. They're both quite useful actually, and they explain well this property. So first of all, how do we define perfect forward secrecy or forward secrecy? Okay, so perfect forward secrecy is a variation of the secrecy property that states simply that or checks simply whether the secrecy of past session keys are dependent on the secrecy of long-term shared or private keys. So in other words, we're trying to understand here if there is a relationship between the secrecy of your long-term password or long-term key and that of the short-term or temporary session keys that you're establishing during each session. So, for example, if a server is, as a result, compromised, let's say, then the question is whether the leak of the private key will result in the compromising of the security of current communications using existing session keys established prior to the server's compromise. So the idea here is that we want to understand whether if you leaking some private key or long-term key, would that impact the security of past historical communications that took place between the two agents, okay, so or the server and the client. More diagrammatically, we can represent the PFS property as follows. So imagine, like what we said before, we have several sessions of the same protocol, and you're carrying out each session after the next one, the previous one, and so on going forward. So there's no overlapping here, the assumption. So each time you run a session, you finish, you establish a key, you exchange certain sensitive messages, you move on to the next session, you establish the new session key, you exchange more sensitive messages, and so on. Okay. So the assumption here is that we're running these sessions one after the other, and each session has got its own session key, K1, K2, until n number of session. Then, at some point in time, we assume that an event happens, okay, and this event will leak the long-term key, okay. So this could be, for example, as a result of brute force attack on the server, or Alice or Bob, or if probably it's because of some kind of a malicious behavior or simple negligence by Alice or Bob. They simply just leak their key to someone else, to Carol. Okay, so this is slightly, in fact, bending the rules that we established earlier on, where we said that we assumed that no leaks of any keys were going to be considered. But in this case, we're slightly bending that rule because we want to study some kind of, or this kind of property, the PFS property, for our protocols. Okay, so the question then will be, if the assumption is that your long-term key was leaked, does that imply that your past session keys are also leaked, and therefore you are compromising the security of any transactions or communications that would have taken place using each of these individual session keys? So let's have a look at an example to understand better this property. So here is an example where the PFS property actually doesn't hold. Okay, so you have a three-way or three-message handshake between Alice and Bob, and in the first message, Alice sends a key K encrypted with Bob's public key, and when Bob receives this message, Bob can decrypt it and then release K. So then Bob returns a message back to Alice encrypted with the key K. When Alice receives this message, she can decrypt it because she has key K and release the message, and then she replies with a new different message, say for example message K, message prime, back to Bob, and that second message itself as well is encrypted with the key K. So when Bob receives this last acknowledgement, he will decrypt it with the same key K. Now the question here that we want to ask ourselves is, what happens in the event that an intruder compromises the private key belonging to Bob? Okay, so the question is, what happens, say, if an intruder, Carol or Charlie, managed to gain access somehow to the key KPRB? So would that impact the security of this protocol, or let's say historical instances of this protocol that took place in the past, or will that have no impact? And particularly, we are worried about whether that will lead to Carol also gaining access to message and message prime, because you can imagine that these two messages could simply be some kind of sensitive transactions, a bank transaction, or some kind of a sensitive message or messages that are being exchanged between Alice and Bob. So the answer to that is yes, there is an impact, and the intruder in this case, as you would imagine, or Carol or Charlie, will be recording. So the intruder or the network, the public network, will be recording all of these messages passing around. Okay, so Carol has got access to K encrypted with KPB, has also got access to this message and this message. Okay, and then of course compromising the private key that belongs to Bob will immediately allow Carol or Charlie to unlock and decrypt K. Okay, so basically release K. So in that case, Charlie or Carol can decrypt this first message here and generate K. Now, if they generate K, of course, it's very easy to see that they can also decrypt this message and decrypt this message here to release the internal sensitive content. So this is an example where a protocol does not hold or stand up to the PFS challenge or property, and as a result, if there was any future event where the key K was actually, or in this case, of course, it's KPRB, was leaked, then that will have impact on any past transactions or communications that took place. So people thought about a solution for this, how to kind of decouple the existing long-term keys from past historical communications. And one solution that again jumps up to our help here is the Diffie-Hellman calculation, okay, or Diffie-Hellman based key agreement or key establishment. So it turns out to be a good solution. So remember, we said last time that essentially Diffie-Hellman was a simple computation where Alice chooses a secret number A, small a, and Bob chooses a secret number small b, and both Alice and Bob have pre-agreed on a couple of prime numbers. Okay. Then the calculations is as follows. Basically, one of them performs p to the power a modulus g, then raises it again to the power b modulus g, and that's equivalent to the opposite side performing p to the power b modulus g raised to the power a modulus g again. Okay, so the two sides will compute both of these sides of the equality here, and that turns out to be the Diffie-Hellman key, or master key if you want to call it, or K. Okay, so it allows them to share a key, a symmetric key. Now, this turns out to be a handy solution when it comes to the decoupling of long-term keys and current transactions that we are carrying out. Okay, so here's an example, this time with the PFS property, or an example of a protocol that respects the PFS property. Okay, so we have a four message handshake or protocol. In the first instance, Alice is sending her calculation of the first step of the Diffie-Hellman key. Okay, so it's not key yet, but it's the first step towards calculating the key, which, remember, this is what the first thing that Alice would do if you look back again to the Diffie-Hellman protocol. So she sends p to the power of small a, her secret number modulus g, and she encrypts that with the current long-term key that she shares with Bob, KAB. Okay, so notice here we're using KAB in a slightly, again, unconventional way, because we're assuming that KAB here is a long-term key or a long-term password. Okay, as opposed to the previous times when we were simply assuming that KAB was always a short-term session key. So in this event here, when basically B receives the first message, B will decrypt it, release the calculation that Alice has performed. Then he sends Alice back his own calculation, again encrypted with KAB. Upon which Alice then will receive this message, she will decrypt it and release Bob's calculation. Of course, as you can see, this allows Bob here to raise it to modulus b, to raise it to the power of b modulus g, and similarly Alice will be able here to raise this number to the power of small a and then modulo g. Okay, so both sides then will end up with the same exact number. Now, once they end up with that exact number, they can use it as a key. Okay, so Alice will take her key now, which is equal to this value. Okay, and she'll use it to encrypt some sensitive message. Then when Bob receives this encryption, Bob can take his own number, okay, or key, which is this one, and he can apply it to this encryption here to attempt to decrypt it. So he will succeed in doing that and therefore release message here. And then he just copies that message as it is and returns it back to Alice, okay, encrypted with his calculation of the DiffieHellman key. Now, when Alice receives this last encrypted message, she will take her own Diffie-Hellman key, which is this number here that she calculated, and she'll apply it to this ciphertext, okay, in a decryption operation, and therefore she will succeed and release the message, okay. Now the question here is, what will happen if KAB gets leaked to some intruder? Okay, so suppose once we've gone through this protocol once or twice or three times, any number of times you want, at some point in time in the future, let's say, what will happen if the key KAB was leaked, as in the event that we have predicted in, let's say, for the PFS property? Okay, will that have an impact on our past sort of transactions, or will that not have any impact? So in this case, of course, the answer is that that will not have an impact, okay, on the secrecy of the session keys, okay, and neither on the secrecy of the two messages being exchanged, okay. And the result or the reason for that is simply because the leaking of this key, okay, which is the same as this key, will only lead the intruder or Carol to be able to discover this information here, okay, and this information here, okay. However, neither this information, okay, nor this information here, which are basically intermediate numbers, can lead to Carol discovering either the master key, which is this one, or this, or performing it through this other calculation, okay, the same key. So basically, in short, Carol will be able to discover the intermediate numbers in the Diffie-Hellman calculation. However, she'll have no way of discovering what the actual key was. Okay. So that's the result. Of course, there is an assumption here that we're making, additional assumption that we're making implicit in all of this, which is that Carol, if she is essentially the one brute forcing Alice or Bob's machines, that she is managing to only leak the long-term password, okay, and that she's not actually leaking the intermediate, sorry, the actual Diffie-Hellman session key, or in other words, that we will, or Alice and Bob will delete this number, okay, in a secure way once the session has terminated. Okay, so there is an assumption there that the actual Diffie-Hellman key, once the session has ended, simply becomes or simply is deleted. Okay, and it's not just deleted, but deleted, of course, in a secure way that Carol will not be able to gain access to if Carol was to break into Alice or Bob's machines. That's the assumption there, and it's for that particular case where let's say that the KAB is let's say hacked into, okay, rather than the scenario where Alice or Bob would inadvertently leak KAB to Carol or to Charlie. There is another solution, of course, as we mentioned or alluded to earlier, which was the use of asymmetric key cryptography or public key cryptography. And this solution relies on what we call temporary key pairs. Okay, so in this case, we have Alice and Bob again communicating with each other in a four-message protocol. So Alice here sends a pair to Bob. The second part is the interesting part where she encrypts a temporary public key that she has created, okay, with the existing long-term key KAB. So when Bob receives this part, he can decrypt it because he's got KAB, and then he can basically use that temporary public key to encrypt the new or a new long-term key K prime, or a new session key if you want to call it, but it's a new KAB basically, a new which we call it K prime AB. So he proposes this new K prime AB, and he encrypts it with the temporary public key that Alice has proposed earlier in the first message, and he encrypts the whole thing again with the key that he shares currently with Alice. So Alice receives this. She can decrypt the outer layer, then she can decrypt again the inner layer here, because she's got the temporary private key that she created with the temporary public key. And then she can release the new sort of long-term or session key K prime AB. Then she uses that new key to send a message to Bob. When Bob receives that, he can decrypt it, reply with an acknowledgement message, message prime, back to Alice. Then Alice will receive that and sort of decrypt it as well, and release the contents. So now the question is, what would happen if our long-term K prime AB, sorry, KAB, was hacked or leaked, or simply, given to Charlie or Carol? Would that actually compromise the question here is, would that compromise the key K prime AB, the new key K prime AB that we're suggesting for the session? So the answer is no, it wouldn't, because again, and again, there is a condition implicit here, that the temporary key pair is simply deleted. Okay, so if the temporary key pair was securely deleted at the end of the session, even if Carol managed to get access to KAB, she won't be able to get access to K prime AB, and the reason is because, as you can very clearly see, that there is sort of an intermediate safety encryption there between separating KAB from K prime AB. Okay, so this temporary safety gap is the encryption that we're performing with the temporary key, public key, KPB temp. Okay, so the assumption, as I said, is again that basically that we will delete this key pair, or that Alice will delete this key pair at the end of the protocol in a secure way. Okay. If she doesn't, then of course there is the risk that Carol will get access to the private temporary key, and then she can use that private temporary key to break this encryption as well and gain access to K prime AB. Okay, so these are a couple of examples of the or of protocols that sort of under the right conditions would hold up to the PFS property. Right, so next half of the seminar is just sort of trying to understand why actually PFS became such an interesting property at some point in time. So if we go back to, particularly by going back to 2014, we see that there was a sudden panic in the world when the Heartbleed bug was discovered at the time. Okay, so maybe you remember or you don't remember, but there was this bug that called Heartbleed that appeared in 2014 or was sort of announced in 2014, which led every company to sort of panic about its web servers and in the context of SSL and whether the web server was sort of open to this exploitation or not. So what this bug did is that it exploited a vulnerability in a protocol called the Heartbeat protocol, which is sort of like a pinging mechanism used by TLS or SSL clients to sort of understand if a server is still alive or not. So the Heartbeat protocol is very simple. You as a client can send a message, say for example hello, to the server, and you specify what the size of that message is. Okay, so if it's hello, for example, then you can say that it's got a size which is 5 digits, for example. Okay. So when the server receives this request, that's like a ping mechanism. The server will look for the first five digits in its memory and return the content back to the client. Okay, so you send hello, the server replies back with hello again. Okay, which is the 5 digits comprising that word or that challenge. However, at some point in time, people found that the implementation of most servers didn't really perform the check on the size. Okay, so if you, for example, lied about the size of the challenge that you're sending. Okay, so for example, you didn't request just 5 digits, you requested more than 5. Okay, so 5 bytes or whatever it is, then you could actually get as many of those as you specified. Okay, and as a result, this meant that there was actually the possibility for disclosing whatever content the server's cache included, and in many instances the servers were implemented in such a way that they would actually keep the private keys that they were using with the clients in past transactions, keeping those in the cache for the sake of performance. Okay, so enhancing the performance of the server. So therefore, this kind of raised the alarm that there is a possibility that this server could essentially leak private keys, and what would the impact of that be on past historical transactions that the server conducted with the clients. So diagrammatically, that's what the scenario looks like. So essentially, you send the challenge, which is hello or hello world, whatever it is, and then you give a payload which is not the number corresponding to the bits or bytes of the message. Okay, so it's essentially much larger number. So in this case, the server wouldn't just return the 5 bytes representing your or digits representing the message itself, but it actually would return more than that. Okay, so 25 in this case. So that would include the hello, but it could also include any user sensitive data that may have existed in the server's cache memory. And that was actually found to be possible up to an unbelievable 64 kilobytes. Okay, so an awful lot of amount of data there that could have been returned back to clients, and it could be just random stuff, but equally it could include some sensitive cached information such as keys or passwords or that kind of stuff. Okay. So that was the context, and at that time, people panicked, and sort of PFS became a world sort of title in the IT world, and everybody was like, "Oh, does my server have, does it have PFS? Does my server have PFS?" And everybody was just, talking about PFS at that time, and people started patching their servers and so on. Okay, so but that's the idea behind it, and it comes from a fundamental design flaw as well in the protocols, where the protocol itself is able to decouple its past sort of session communications from its long-term keys or passwords. Now here we look at very quickly at a slightly different flavor of the PFS property. It isn't actually PFS strictly speaking, but it kind of is relevant to PFS. Okay, but when we mention PFS, you should always sort of look at this scenario. Okay, so this is the sort of canonical or the strict definition of perfect forward secrecy, but here we're just mentioning this sort of second flavor, if you like, because it is sort of interesting from a design perspective. Okay, so here's a protocol which contains 4 initial communications between Alice and Bob, establishing a new key K prime AB using an existing key KAB. And once those communications are completed, then the two sides will exchange a pair of sensitive messages using the new key K prime AB that they've established. You can assume KAB here as being your long-term key and K prime AB being a short-term session key that they want to establish just for the purpose of communication in this session. So here's an interesting attack scenario or attack trace that makes us think a little bit about what could happen if, say, for example, the key K prime AB, which is your short-term session key that you establish at the end of your first session, okay, or the jth session, or session number J. What would happen if that key K prime AB was compromised? Okay, so this is an event here, and we represent it in this way because we're essentially saying that this leak that's happening to K prime AB, it isn't a leak essentially happening as a result of the protocol itself or as a result of some kind of attack scenario or attack trace along the lines of what we will cover next time. But It is simply an external event which is bending the rules that we established earlier that were saying, don't leak, we don't assume any leaks, we don't assume any hacks, no statistical attacks, and so on. So we're slightly bending those here, and we're assuming that bang, here you go, K prime AB has simply ended up in Carol's or on Carol's machine. Okay, and so the question is, if that does happen, well, what is the effect of that going to be on future sessions? Okay, so for example, the next session, the session number J plus 1, okay, what will that do? So there is an interesting attack here actually on this new session, which basically happens at the fourth and last step. Okay, so in this step here, instead of Alice receiving the message that was intended to contain a new session key K double prime AB, she will instead be blocked. Okay, so the message will be blocked. For example, Carol might be running some kind of jamming device on Alice, or Alice has just completely been isolated in some way from receiving this message, or perhaps just Carol, if she's running the routers or switches on the network, she'll just steal this particular packet, communicated packet, and not allow it to arrive at Alice. Okay, so the assumption is that Carol will steal this, so it will never arrive to Alice, and then Carol will simply send an alternative message. Okay, and this message is a copy of the fourth message that she was listening to when the first session was taking place, or session number J. Okay, so she'll copy that fourth message from there, and instead of sending or allowing the legitimate fourth message belonging to the second session to go through, she'll block that and she'll replace it by the old message, okay, which contains the old key K prime AB. Okay, so she sends that to Alice instead, and therefore Alice then will think, okay, well, actually, do you know what? I need to use this key for my communications with Bob. Okay, so of course there are a lot of assumptions here that go under the carpet, including that Alice is not checking for the freshness of the corresponding nonce, and so on. But nonetheless, there is a risk that if Alice is badly implemented and she doesn't check for this nonce and some other conditions, then it'll allow basically Alice to believe that this new key, this alt key is the new key, okay, for the new session. And of course, we did say here that the key was compromised, and therefore that renders any communications taking place in the J plus 1 session between Alice and Bob to be basically compromised or insecure. Okay. So in this scenario, the question that we're asking ourselves is not historical transactions going backward, but it's rather future transactions. Okay, so if you did leak some either session key or long-term key, what would the impact of that be on your future sessions? Okay. Of course, you can also ask yourself the classical PFS question: what would happen to the past sessions? Okay. So, of course, here nothing would happen to past sessions, and you can verify that if you want as an offline exercise. Okay, that's all for today. Thank you very much for listening. Goodbye.